The early American colonies lined the eastern seaboard of North America. We really hadn't gone very far west, so the densest part of our population were all clustered in cities that were across the Atlantic Ocean seaboard, and fish fueled our economy. To get to this country in the first place, you were crossing the Atlantic Ocean. And from the time that your feet stepped off of that ship and onto the soil, you were tied to the Atlantic Ocean. And fishing was a huge industry. We had sailors, we had fishermen, we had people processing and selling fish. So much of the economy was based around fish, and people ate fish like crazy. So being a born and bred Midwest boy, sometimes seafood can seem like a fanciful thing to me. I didn't grow up eating seafood all the time unless it was bluegill or bass caught in the lake down the road or in the river. Crab legs, lobster, clams, mussels, those types of things always seem like this far off kind of extravagant food. And that's not necessarily at all how people nowadays think about it that live in places that seafood is readily available. And it is certainly not how people thought about seafood back in the 18th century. They were eating it all the time, they had it at their disposal, and they could get it anywhere that they wanted. You're going to see seafood at the lowest table and at the highest table. And there are a lot of people that are going to say that things like lobster and crab were always lowly dishes, but we see them on king's plates. We see high people in society eating lobster all the time. I think a lot of it has to do with the preparation. So everybody from the lowest in society to the highest in society, they're eating seafood, and it seems like most of them are eating the same types of seafood, but they're preparing them in vastly different ways. So fish is one of those things, like I said, that's a huge industry, or it's something that Joe Workaday, anybody, can go out to a stream and catch fish for dinner. People were trapping fish, people were using huge nets to catch thousands of fish, and people were using a line with a hook to catch one at a time. And that's happening all over the colonies. One of my favorite books to get an insight into just the day-to-day life of somebody is the Journal of Matthew Paton. In that journal, he talks about fish quite a bit, and it's interesting how he uses fish. He'll oftentimes go fishing with friends, and he'll talk about how sometimes they caught a single fish, they caught a shad, and it was a disappointment. He talks about one time where he went out with a couple buddies, and on hook and line, they caught 82 fish. And what Matthew Paton would do is he had access to a stream, so he had a fish trap. And I believe that he even took fish that he caught elsewhere and he stored them in this trap. And what he did was use them as currency oftentimes, which is a really interesting way to think about food. Some people have a hard time getting food, and then some people don't have access to a stream where they can get fish. So he oftentimes would pay for goods from his neighbors, or he would borrow, and I know that I say the word borrow here, and it doesn't sound like it's a borrow, it sounds like he's taking a cup of flour. He would take a cup of flour from his neighbor, and then he would take them over a fish. You'll see that a lot in workaday people in the time period. So the working man in our time period is eating what they have at their disposal, and we've talked a lot about William Ellis and how in his book he's talking about farmers. There's not a whole lot of fish mentioned in that because they're growing grain, and he's basing a lot of the diet that he's feeding to these working men off of what they're growing. So if you're not in a place that fish is readily available, then that's not what you're going to be eating. But most of the country had fish at their disposal, and there were a lot of jobs that were tied to that, especially fishermen. And now we'll read a lot of accounts where fishermen, they're not crazy about eating fish. They get tired of it. They don't want that. And so they can get meat and they can get other things, but they're bringing in these vast catches, sometimes 25,000 fish in a day, to bring to the market and sell to other people. And these people are able to get fish whenever they want to. I want to make 3 dishes today, and they're going to be very simple dishes because we're looking at food that the working man is eating. You can find extravagant recipes for all sorts of fish in these cookbooks that we cover, but we're going to take it down to its bare bones today. We're going to do a boiled lobster, a fried shrimp, pan fried, and we're going to do a breaded fried cod. So the first one we're going to use is lobster. Lobster was readily available. People were eating lobster all the time. As we look further and further into the cookbooks, into the journals of the time period, we're seeing that lobster is kind of craved at these high tables and in these high places. I did a recipe not too long ago that was for a lobster fricassee, and that is a very extravagant, expensive dish. For this lobster, we're simply going to boil a lobster tail. That would have been for anybody in the time period would be able to afford that. They can catch lobsters, they can put it in boiling water. It's that easy and it's delicious. So just like any other crop, you catch a lot of fish, and what are you gonna do with that fish to make it last for a long time? You're going to preserve it. And that is the plight of the working man. The working man is feast and famine, right? We've got a bounty here. Now we've got to stretch this, and that's happening with fish just like anything else. Now I found this book called A Treatise of Fishing, Herrings, Cod, and Salmon, How to Cure and Preserve Them. It was written in 1800, and really it was collected in 1800 because it's really just they're begging and borrowing from a lot of different texts that they found. But it was really interesting because it had methods of preserving salmon in more countries than I thought salmon even existed in. This covers Canada, China, England, Scotland, Holland, Russia, Sweden, and Germany. It's just crazy. I didn't even know the salmon was plentiful in all of those places. But how all of these different people are preserving them. They talk about how the Canadians, they have the ability to just keep them frozen for long periods of time throughout the winter, and they'll last just fine. And then they talk about drying fish. They talk about salting fish. Some people would just leave their fish out in the sun to dry, and that was a very common method. Salting fish. We have salt cod sitting right here, and we've covered a lot with salting in the past, but you'll salt this to preserve it, and then you'll soak it numerous times to help get the salt out of there, and then you can use it as food later on, after months after you thought that you would be able to. We talk about potted salmon, and we've covered that on the channel before, where you're basically taking your salmon and you're submerging it in clarified butter, and that's sealing off the top in sort of a canning method. So all of these people are catching this fish, and they're keeping it maybe in live tanks, maybe freezing, and maybe even they're having to preserve it in pots. They're pickling it, they're drying it, and they're salting it, which is really interesting because we don't have to do that in America these days. We have deep freezes, and it's really easy for us to keep our food. But these folks, they had to think about the whole year. They constantly planned ahead, and that is the plight of the working man. We're also going to do a shrimp recipe today, and by recipe, that's it's a very loose recipe, right? We're gonna take some butter and we're gonna put it in the pan. You're gonna need to devein and deshell your shrimp. Mine are already done. Then you're gonna throw them in the pan, and you're just gonna get them in a little heat. They don't take long to cook. Keep them on one side until it starts to turn a little bit of pink. Then you turn it on the other side. It just takes a few minutes, but man, is it a delicious dish. So this is a reading that I found. There was actually somebody that was researching the monuments of Ireland, but what he had to say about shrimp was really interesting. He said, "And the shrimp are of a sweet and tender flesh, restorative and hectic, and esteemed more delicate and wholesome than lobsters or oysters. They are eaten boiled in water or fried." I think it's really interesting that they thought that shrimp beat out lobsters and oysters in this particular scenario. I don't think that you would see that in a whole lot of scenarios now today. I mean, if you go into a seafood restaurant, oysters and lobsters, they're at the top of the menu. They're king. That's top shelf food. Shrimp can be pretty lowly. So I just thought that was really interesting. So speaking of preserving fish, one thing that we've talked about on the channel is stockfish. I found this book. It's called The Seaman's Guide. We've used it on the channel. It was written in 1797, and it's basically a book where they're talking about living comfortably at sea. And I thought that this reading was really fun, so I'd bring it to the channel. At one period, it was customary to give stockfish in India ships, but was not found to answer. The original cost was dear, requiring an allowance of oil, mustard, and vinegar. And the trouble it took in preparing and beating disgusted the men so much that at least half of it was thrown overboard. The best fish to carry to sea would be herrings, but they must be cooked in the same manner now practiced by the poor people in Scotland. They soak it in water until they become pretty fresh. They are then hung up in the sun and wind on a stick through the eyes to dry, and then boiled or broiled. In this way they eat almost as well as if they were new caught. That sounds really yummy, doesn't it? And the last dish that we're going to do today is cod, and you can do this with perch, you can do this with all sorts of fish. So we're gonna take our fillet, it's going to be wet, we're gonna dry it off a little bit, and we're going to put it in the flour, get flour on both sides with a little bit of salt and pepper, and then we're gonna put it in the pan with butter, and we're gonna fry it until it's done. Fish does not take long to cook. You don't wanna overcook it, you wanna watch it. Each side's gonna turn golden brown and it's gonna have a nice flaky white fish inside. The fishing industry in our time period is massive. Some of it crosses over with just general sailing. There are people that are building ships or repairing ships, making sails, repairing sails, and that crosses over into spice trade or naval ships. That's what is happening. The ocean is the superhighway. But at the same time, very specifically, there are people that are making fish nets, and they're making them on a massive scale or a very small scale. There are people that are making fish line and fish hooks. You've got oyster shuckers and fishmongers who are barely above the poverty line or maybe below the poverty line, but they're still working in that fish trade. It is covering the society from the lowest to the highest, and it is very, very plentiful. You look at this plate and you think, man, that looks good, and it looks like it's a fancy upper class plate. And I think that that keeps happening more and more, where food that we're going to eat now in fine restaurants is kind of working class food of the time period, and we just keep seeing that trend. Really, this would have been available to anybody that was a working class family in the time period that we're discussing, and it looks delicious. Let's give it a try. We're gonna try a piece of this lobster first. I dug a little bit out. It's gonna be sweet. It's not buttery. I don't have that fine butter sauce that we're used to dipping lobster into because we're trying to stay cheap on this. But man, is it good, especially with a little bit of lemon on there. All right, we've got some fried cod, just flour, salt, and pepper. That's great. That flour got way crispier on the outside than I thought it would. Nice flaky white fish on the inside. Wonderful. All right, now we're gonna try this shrimp, and I know that this shrimp got a lot of lemon juice on it. I'm really excited to try it. It's just pan fried in butter. What can go wrong? I love shrimp. This is so good. This is the working man's seafood. It is delicious. You should try it at home.